Picture this. A woman stands in front of a hospital. She's 23 years old. In her arms, she holds a 7-month-old baby girl. The year is 1997. Seoul, South Korea. The woman's hands are trembling, not from the cold, from something far worse, from a decision that will haunt her for the rest of her life. She kisses the baby's forehead one last time. She whispers something in Korean, something the baby will never remember. Then she walks inside, and when she walks out 30 minutes later, her arms are empty. This is the story of what happened next. And I promise you, it's not what you think. Because when we talk about adoption, we tell ourselves a story, a beautiful story, a story about sacrifice and love and second chances. We tell ourselves that giving up a child for a better life is the ultimate act of maternal devotion. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes the truth is so much darker, so much more complicated, so much more heartbreaking than we ever allow ourselves to imagine. This is one of those stories. Let me take you back to where this really begins, not to 1997, but to 1974. Because to understand what happened to this little girl, you need to understand the machine that was waiting for her, the system that had been perfected over decades, the industry that turned human beings into commodities. In 1974, South Korea was still recovering from the devastation of the Korean War, which had ended just 21 years earlier in 1953. The country was poor, desperately poor. The GDP per capita was just $490. To put that in perspective, in the United States at that same time, it was $7,119. South Korea was developing, modernizing, trying to shake off the trauma of war and colonization. And there was a problem. A massive problem that the government saw as an obstacle to progress. Too many orphans, too many children born out of wedlock, too many mouths to feed in a country that could barely feed itself. The solution: export them. I'm not being dramatic. That's literally what they did. Between 1953 and 2020, South Korea sent approximately 200,000 children overseas for international adoption. 200,000. That's more than any other country in the world, more than China, more than Russia, more than Ethiopia. South Korea, a country that would eventually become one of the world's most advanced economies, built its early development in part on the systematic removal of its unwanted children. By the 1990s, when our story takes place, South Korea had perfected the adoption system into a well-oiled machine. There were agencies, licensed, legitimate businesses with offices in Seoul and satellite branches in major American cities. These agencies had connections with hospitals, with social workers, with desperate mothers who found themselves pregnant and alone. The promise they made was simple, beautiful even. Give us your child and we will find them a better life. A life with 2 parents, a house with a backyard, good schools, opportunities you could never provide, the American dream wrapped up in a pink or blue blanket. And for many mothers, this promise was irresistible. Because what kind of mother would deny her child a better life? The baby girl from our opening scene, let's call her Sarah. That's the name her adoptive parents would give her, but in the hospital in Seoul, she had a different name. A Korean name that would be erased from every official document, replaced with something easier for American tongues to pronounce. Sarah's biological mother, we'll call her Ji-yeon, was 23 years old. She worked in a textile factory in Seoul, one of thousands of young women who had migrated from rural areas to the city for work. The pay was terrible. The hours were brutal. 70, sometimes 80 hours a week, standing at a sewing machine in a factory that was too hot in summer and too cold in winter. Ji-yeon had gotten pregnant by a man she thought loved her. A man who disappeared the moment she told him about the baby. In South Korea in 1997, single motherhood wasn't just difficult. It was social suicide. You would lose your job. Your family would disown you. Your child would be marked for life as a child of shame. So when the social worker at the hospital told Ji-yeon about adoption, about the American couple who was waiting, who had already been approved, who had a nursery ready, who had money and stability and love to give, what choice did she have? The social worker showed her photos, a man and a woman, both white, both smiling, standing in front of a 2-story house with a manicured lawn. They were in their late 30s, financially stable. The woman was a teacher. The man worked in insurance. They'd been trying to have children for 8 years. They'd spent tens of thousands of dollars on fertility treatments. Nothing worked. Adoption was their last hope. They wanted a baby. Specifically, they wanted a girl, preferably an infant under 1 year old, and they were willing to pay. Here's what nobody tells you about international adoption. The money, the staggering amounts of money that change hands. In 1997, adopting a child from South Korea cost between $15,000 and $25,000. That included agency fees, legal fees, processing fees, travel costs, donations to the orphanage. Let me break that down. In today's dollars, that's between $28,000 and $46,000 for a single child. Now, did Ji-yeon see any of that money? Of course not. She signed the papers for free. She relinquished her parental rights in a tiny office with fluorescent lighting and a social worker who barely looked at her. The entire process took less than 45 minutes. The agency told her that Sarah would go to a good family. They showed her those photos one more time. They gave her a standard release form written in dense legal language she barely understood. They told her she could write a letter to her daughter, something Sarah might read when she was older. Ji-yeon wrote 2 pages in shaky handwriting. She sealed it in an envelope. The social worker took it and promised it would be included in Sarah's adoption file. That letter never made it to America. Years later, when Sarah would request her adoption records, that envelope would be nowhere to be found. Just one of many documents that mysteriously disappeared in the bureaucratic machinery of international adoption. 3 months later, Sarah arrived in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It was February 1998. She was 10 months old. She'd spent the previous 3 months in a foster care facility in Seoul, one of dozens of babies waiting for their processing to be completed, for their visa approvals to come through, for their new parents to wire the final payment. Her adoptive parents, let's call them Michael and Patricia Thompson, were overjoyed. They'd waited so long for this moment. They'd painted the nursery pink. They'd bought more clothes and toys than one baby could ever need. They'd read books about adoption, about attachment theory, about how to help their daughter adjust to her new life. And for the first few years, everything seemed perfect. Sarah was a beautiful child. Big brown eyes, straight black hair, a smile that could light up a room. She hit all her developmental milestones. She learned to walk at 12 months, started talking at 18 months. By the time she was 3, she was speaking perfect English with a Midwestern accent. No trace of the language she'd heard in her first 10 months of life. The Thompsons loved their daughter. Let me be very clear about that. This is not a story about evil adoptive parents. Michael and Patricia were good people who genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. They fed her, clothed her, sent her to a good school, took her to Disney World, celebrated her birthdays with elaborate parties. But here's what they didn't prepare for. Here's what no one prepared them for. The questions, the stares, the constant, relentless otherness that Sarah would experience every single day of her life. See, Minneapolis in the 1990s and 2000s was not particularly diverse. Sarah's elementary school was 92% white. In her entire grade of 83 children, there were 3 Asian students. 2 were adopted like her. 1 was the child of immigrant parents from Vietnam. Starting in kindergarten, Sarah experienced something that would become a defining feature of her childhood: the questions. Why don't you look like your mom and dad? Where are you really from? Can you speak Chinese? Why did your real parents give you away? That last question, That one cut the deepest, because Sarah didn't know the answer. She was too young to understand the complexities of international adoption, of poverty, of social stigma, of limited choices. All she knew was that somewhere in the world there was a woman who had given birth to her and then decided she wasn't worth keeping. By the time Sarah hit middle school, the cracks were starting to show. This is incredibly common among transracial adoptees. Studies show that between 40 and 52% of transracial adoptees experience significant identity issues during adolescence and early adulthood. That's compared to about 28% of same-race adoptees. Sarah looked in the mirror and saw a face that didn't match her family. She looked at her mother's blue eyes and father's light brown hair and felt like an alien. She tried to fit in at school, but she was too Asian for the white kids and not Asian enough for the few Asian students who had grown up with their culture intact. The Thompsons tried to help, they really did. They took Sarah to Korean cultural events. They enrolled her in Korean language classes at a local community center. They made kimchi at home, following recipes from a cookbook, but it all felt performative. Surface level, like putting on a costume of a culture that should have been hers by birthright, but instead felt foreign and inaccessible. Here's something crucial to understand. When a child is adopted internationally, especially as an infant, they don't just lose their biological parents. They lose their language, their culture, their entire heritage. They're placed into a family and a community that looks nothing like them, that has no connection to where they came from. And here's the really insidious part. They're told to be grateful, constantly, relentlessly, told how lucky they are, how blessed, how they should thank their adoptive parents every day for saving them from a life of poverty or institutionalization. But Sarah didn't feel saved. By 14, she felt erased. She started acting out, small things at first, talking back, missing curfew. Her grades slipped from straight A's to B's and C's. Michael and Patricia took her to a therapist, a nice white woman in her 50s, who specialized in adolescent issues. The therapist diagnosed Sarah with depression and prescribed antidepressants. But medication couldn't fix what was really wrong, because what Sarah was experiencing wasn't just teenage angst or a chemical imbalance. It was a profound existential crisis, a question that consumed her every waking moment. Who am I? When Sarah turned 18, she made a decision. She was going to find her birth mother. She was going to get answers to the questions that had haunted her entire life. This was 2015. The internet had made searching for birth families easier than ever before. There were Facebook groups for Korean adoptees, databases, DNA testing services, entire networks of people helping adoptees navigate the complex, often frustrating process of accessing their adoption records. Sarah started with the agency that had handled her adoption. She filled out the required forms. She paid the processing fee of $350. She waited and waited and waited. 6 months later, she received a packet in the mail. Inside were 12 pages of documents. Most of it was administrative paperwork, processing forms, medical records from when she was an infant, a few photos of her in the foster care facility in Seoul. And that was it. No letter from her birth mother, no identifying information, no names, no addresses, no phone numbers. Just a brief paragraph explaining that her mother had been young, unmarried, and unable to care for her. That the adoption had been voluntary and legal. That her mother had requested complete confidentiality. That last line hit Sarah like a truck. Complete confidentiality. In other words, her birth mother didn't want to be found. But Sarah couldn't accept that. She joined online forums. She connected with other Korean adoptees who were searching. She learned about the systematic failures in record keeping, the documents that were falsified or destroyed, the corruption that had plagued the adoption system for decades, because here's something the agencies don't advertise. Many international adoptions from South Korea in the 80s and 90s were not entirely above board. In 2012, the Korean government launched an investigation and found that in many cases, birth records had been falsified. Children who had living parents were registered as orphans. Mothers who wanted to keep their children were pressured or coerced into relinquishing them. There were even cases, dozens of them, where children were essentially kidnapped, taken from mothers who thought they were placing their child in temporary foster care, only to discover weeks later that their child had been sent overseas and adopted by strangers. Was Sarah one of those cases? She didn't know. But the more she learned, the more determined she became to find out the truth. In 2017, Sarah's search finally yielded results, but not in the way she expected. She'd sent her DNA to 23andMe, one of the major consumer genetic testing services. She wasn't particularly hopeful. What were the odds that her birth mother or any biological relative had also taken a DNA test and uploaded their results to the same database? But then, 8 months later, she got a notification, a DNA match, a second cousin, a woman living in Los Angeles who was also Korean, also adopted, also searching for her biological family. Through that connection, through months of detective work and genealogical research, Sarah was able to identify a possible aunt, her birth mother's sister. The aunt lived in Busan, South Korea's second largest city. Sarah sent her a message through Facebook, her hands shaking so badly she could barely type. The response came 3 days later. Yes, the aunt confirmed. She had a sister who had given up a baby for adoption in 1997, a baby girl, born in July. Sarah's birthday was July 15th, 1997. The aunt agreed to pass along Sarah's contact information, but she warned Sarah. Her sister, Ji-yeon, had never told anyone about the baby. Not her parents, not her husband, not the 2 children she'd had later, Sarah's half-siblings. The pregnancy and adoption were a secret she'd carried for 20 years. Ji-yeon was afraid, ashamed, terrified that if her family found out, they would judge her, reject her, that her husband would leave her, that her children would never look at her the same way again. But she agreed to meet Sarah. Just once, just to answer her questions. They met in a coffee shop in Seoul in November 2017. Sarah had saved for a year to afford the plane ticket. She'd taken a leave of absence from her job at a non-profit in Minneapolis. She'd told her adoptive parents where she was going, and they'd supported her, even though she could see the hurt in their eyes. Ji-yeon arrived 15 minutes early. She sat in the corner, nursing a cup of green tea she was too nervous to drink. When Sarah walked in, Ji-yeon knew immediately it was her daughter. She had Sarah's eyes, the same shape, the same depth. They sat across from each other, 2 strangers connected by biology and trauma. For the first 5 minutes, neither of them spoke. They just stared, tears streaming down both their faces. Finally, Ji-yeon spoke, in halting English. She told Sarah the story I've been telling you, the factory job, the boyfriend who abandoned her, the social worker who made adoption sound like the only option, the photos of the American couple that looked like a fairy tale. She told Sarah about the day she gave her away, how she'd held her in the hospital room for hours, memorizing her face, the shape of her fingers, the sound of her breathing, how she'd kissed her forehead and whispered, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I love you. I'm doing this because I love you." She told Sarah about the years after, the guilt, the nightmares, the wondering. What did her daughter look like now? Was she happy? Did she hate her? Every July 15th, on Sarah's birthday, Ji-yeon would go to a temple and light incense and pray for the daughter she would never know. And then Sarah asked the question she'd been carrying for 20 years. Why didn't you try to find me? Why did you request complete confidentiality? Ji-yeon looked confused. She didn't request confidentiality. She'd written a letter. She'd asked the agency to keep her updated, to send photos if possible. She'd given them every piece of contact information she had. The agency never contacted her, not once in 20 years. What Sarah discovered next would shake her to her core, because the more she and Ji-yeon compared their stories, the more inconsistencies emerged. The adoption papers Ji-yeon had signed said one thing. The documents Sarah had received from the agency said something completely different. According to Ji-yeon's papers, she had agreed to an open adoption. She was supposed to receive annual updates, photos, basic information about Sarah's well-being. That's what the social worker had promised her. According to Sarah's papers, Ji-yeon had requested a closed adoption with zero contact. The agency claimed they had no forwarding address for Ji-yeon, that she had moved and couldn't be located, but Ji-yeon had lived in the same apartment in Seoul for 18 years. The address was in the phone book. A simple Google search would have found her. Someone had lied, either the Korean agency, the American agency, or both. Sarah filed formal complaints. She hired a lawyer in Seoul who specialized in adoption cases. What they uncovered was part of a much larger pattern. In 2016, a Reuters investigation exposed massive corruption in South Korea's adoption system. They found that agencies had routinely falsified documents to make adoptions process faster and generate more revenue. They found that birth mothers were often given incomplete or misleading information. They found that many adoptions categorized as abandoned orphans actually involved mothers who wanted to keep their children, but were told they couldn't. Between 1953 and 2012, over 165,000 children were sent from South Korea to the United States. The adoption agencies involved in these transactions generated hundreds of millions of dollars in fees. Follow the money. Always follow the money. For every child placed with an American family, agencies earned between $15,000 and $30,000. Korean agencies received about 40% of that. American agencies kept the rest. Social workers got bonuses for every child they processed. Lawyers got fees for expediting paperwork. It was an industry, a business, and the product was human beings. Sarah's reunion with Ji-yeon didn't end with a Hollywood-style happy ending. It couldn't, because too much had been lost. Too many years. Too much pain. Ji-yeon eventually told her family about Sarah. Her husband was supportive, though shocked. Her two children, Sarah's half-siblings, were curious but cautious. They exchanged Facebook messages. They video-chatted a few times, but they didn't have a real relationship. They were strangers who happened to share DNA. Sarah continued to struggle with her identity. Meeting Ji-yeon answered some questions, but raised so many more. She felt caught between two worlds, too American for Korea, too Korean for America. She belonged nowhere fully. This is the reality for hundreds of thousands of transracial adoptees around the world. Studies from the University of Minnesota in 2019 found that Korean adoptees in America have suicide rates 4 times higher than the general population. 4 times. They have higher rates of substance abuse, mental health issues, and relationship problems. Why? Because adoption, especially transracial international adoption, isn't the simple, beautiful fairy tale we've been sold. It's complicated, it's traumatic, it involves profound loss, even when it also involves love. Sarah started speaking publicly about her experience. She joined advocacy groups pushing for reform in international adoption practices. She fought for better record-keeping, for adoptee rights to access their original birth certificates, for regulations preventing agencies from lying to birth mothers. She also worked on repairing her relationship with her adoptive parents, because Michael and Patricia weren't villains in this story. They were people who had acted with good intentions within a corrupt system. They loved Sarah. They'd done their best. But their best couldn't undo the fundamental wound at the heart of Sarah's existence. Let me tell you some numbers. Numbers that should make us all deeply uncomfortable. Worldwide, there have been approximately 5 million international adoptions since 1948, 5 million children removed from their birth countries and placed with families in wealthier nations. The majority of these children came from poor countries and went to rich ones. South Korea, China, Russia, Guatemala, Ethiopia, Vietnam, the list goes on. These adoptions generated an estimated $40 to $50 billion in agency fees, legal costs, and related services over those decades. $40 to $50 billion. Now, many of those adoptions were legitimate, many were necessary, many resulted in genuinely loving families and positive outcomes. I'm not suggesting all international adoption is evil or corrupt, but we have to be honest about what happened. We have to acknowledge the economic incentives that drove the system, the way poverty was exploited, the way mothers were coerced, the way children became commodities. In 2008, Guatemala was forced to shut down its international adoption program after investigations revealed widespread corruption and child trafficking. Between 2000 and 2008, Guatemala had been sending approximately 4,000 to 5,000 children per year to the United States. That's 1 out of every 100 Guatemalan babies born. In 2013, Russia banned all American adoptions after multiple cases of adopted Russian children dying from abuse and neglect in their American homes. Between 1992 and 2013, 19 Russian adoptees died in the United States from preventable causes. In 2018, Uganda exposed a network of fake orphanages that were taking children from poor families under false pretenses and presenting them as orphans available for international adoption. The pattern repeats. Poor country. Wealthy adopters, money changes hands, children disappear into new families, new names, new identities, and we call it rescue. We call it charity. We call it love. So what's the lesson here? What are we supposed to take away from Sarah's story? First, that adoption is not simple. It's not just about giving a child a better life. It's about severing a child from their roots, from their heritage, from everything they might have been. Sometimes that severance is necessary. Sometimes it's the best option in a terrible situation. But we must acknowledge the cost, the loss, the trauma that even the most loving adoptive family cannot fully heal. Second, that systems built on profit will always be vulnerable to corruption. When there's money to be made from human need, from human desperation, people will cut corners. They will lie. They will exploit. We saw it in adoption. We see it in healthcare. We see it in education. We see it in every industry where human welfare meets capitalism. Third, that good intentions are not enough. Michael and Patricia Thompson had the best intentions. The adoption agencies claimed to have good intentions. The social workers, the lawyers, everyone involved believed they were helping, but intention without accountability, without transparency, without examining the power dynamics at play, leads to harm. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, that we need to listen to the voices of adoptees themselves. For too long, the conversation about adoption has been dominated by adoptive parents and agencies. The people who are actually adopted, who live the experience, have been told to be grateful, to stay silent, to not rock the boat. But adoptees like Sarah are speaking up now. They're telling their stories. They're demanding reforms. They're insisting that we reckon with the complexity, the pain, the unresolved questions that adoption creates. Sarah is 33 years old now, as of 2025. She lives in Seattle. She works as a social worker, specializing in helping other adoptees navigate their identity issues and search processes. She's in therapy. She's building a life. She talks to Ji-yeon every few months. They have a relationship, but it's not a mother-daughter relationship. It's more like two survivors of the same disaster, checking in on each other. Ji-yeon still carries guilt. Sarah still carries anger, but they're trying. Sarah also maintains a relationship with Michael and Patricia. They're her parents, not her only parents, not her real parents in the way people used to mean that term, but parents nonetheless. They raised her. They loved her. That counts for something, even if it couldn't fill the hole left by her removal from her birth culture. If you ask Sarah whether she's glad she was adopted, she'll tell you it's the wrong question, because there's no alternate timeline where she can compare. There's no way to know what her life would have been like if Ji-yeon had kept her. Maybe it would have been harder. Maybe she would have grown up poor. Maybe she would have faced different kinds of discrimination and struggle. Or maybe she would have grown up knowing who she was, connected to her language, her culture, her people. Maybe she would have had Ji-yeon. Maybe that would have been enough. We'll never know. That's the tragedy at the heart of every adoption story, the unknowable, the road not taken, the life that might have been. So here's what I want you to take away from this. When you hear adoption stories, when you see those heartwarming videos of parents meeting their adopted children for the first time, when you see the Facebook posts about Gotcha Day and Forever Family, I want you to remember Sarah. Remember Ji-yeon. Remember the 200,000 Korean children who were sent overseas. Remember the mothers who were told they had no choice. Remember the billion-dollar industry built on human separation. Hold space for complexity. Acknowledge that something can be both beautiful and tragic. That love can coexist with loss. That families can be built in many ways, but every way carries a cost. And if you're considering adoption, international or otherwise, do your research, ask hard questions, demand transparency. Make sure the agency you're working with prioritizes the well-being of the child and the birth family, not just the desires of adoptive parents. Support family preservation efforts, support programs that help mothers keep their children when that's what they want. Adoption should be a last resort, not a first option. Because here's the truth that makes everyone uncomfortable. Most children who are adopted internationally aren't orphans. They have parents. They have families. Those families are just too poor, too stigmatized, too unsupported to keep them. If we really want to help children, maybe we should be helping their families first. Maybe we should be addressing the poverty, the lack of social services, the discrimination that makes parents feel they have no choice but to give up their children. Maybe we should be asking not, how can we adopt more children, but how can we make sure fewer children need to be adopted in the first place? Sarah's mother gave her up for a better life. And maybe Sarah did have a better life, materially speaking. She grew up in a house instead of a cramped apartment. She got a college education. She had opportunities. But she also lost her mother, her language, her culture, her sense of belonging. She spent decades wondering who she was, where she came from, whether she'd been wanted. Was it worth it? Ask Sarah that question and she'll tell you she doesn't know. How do you measure a life? How do you weigh opportunity against identity, security against belonging, material comfort against existential wholeness? There's no math for that, no equation that spits out a clear answer. There's only the story, Sarah's story, Ji-yeon's story, and the hundreds of thousands of stories just like theirs, playing out across the world, every single day. Stories of love and loss, of sacrifice and survival, of mothers and daughters separated by oceans and policies, and the cruel mathematics of global inequality. Stories that should make us weep and think and demand we do better. Because every child deserves a family. But even more than that, every child deserves to keep the family they were born into whenever possible. Every mother deserves real choices, real support, real options beyond giving away her child. That's the better life we should be fighting for, not adoption as rescue, but family preservation as justice. That's Sarah's story. That's the truth about what she got when her mother gave her up for a better life. She got survival. She got opportunity. She got love from people who desperately wanted her, but she also got loss. Profound, irreplaceable loss. And no amount of opportunity can ever fully compensate for that. Remember that. The next time someone tells you adoption is beautiful, remember that it's also heartbreaking. Both things are true, And maybe, if we remember that, we can start building a world where fewer children have to experience either one.